I'm not sure that I've actually drawn up an agenda for this presentation, but thank you, Rowan, for giving me the opportunity to sort of think about and to sort of try and map out something that I've been kind of becoming more aware of gradually, and that I think we are seeing the beginnings of the revival of history from below. So really what I want to do today is just to point to some of the things which are happening, and perhaps you can help me in the discussion to think about the kinds of questions that we might want to set for this agenda. And as I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking about what are the reasons why we might be seeing this revival of history from below, and that it's got something to do with the with digitisation, but more particularly with the opening of the archives and the kind of potential democratisation of knowledge and practice that can mean. It's also obviously got something to do with the public engagement agenda, or the dreaded impact agenda, which is making us think about our work in new ways. And I think it's got a lot to do with social media as a kind of different form of communication, a much more interactive form of communication, which I think isn't just another way of disseminating our work. I think it can actually make us think in different ways. But, of course, last Thursday, this kind of thinking about history from below suddenly took a kind of really, you know, that actually this is now going to be a really important and really, I think, quite kind of urgent agenda for us, having seen the kind of spectacular, devastating defeat of the left and the kind of progressive alliances. And so I just want to begin by going back to what we tend to think about when we think of people's history, which is the development really in the 1970s of the history workshop movement. And one of the places which was absolutely central to the development of people's history from below was, of course, Oxford, but in particular Ruskin College, the Trades Union College, where students became active as researchers and were involved in running the annual history workshops. So this came out of a radical tradition of education rooted in the labour movements. And it was also very much part of community building and community activism. It was part of a collaboration between researchers, between scholars, independent scholars, students, and members of the community. So we've got here one of the many collections of essays that the History Workshop produced, and I think that that's from the 3-volume sets on understanding patriotism that I think we're probably all now going to have to go back to and have a look about and think about what we can learn from that and what might be different about the moment that we're in. But also I just want to point out 2 really kind of important projects which took part of this movement. One was the Queen's Park Books in Brighton, where historians worked with people, particularly I think from the Moulscombe estate on the edge of Brighton, on writing their own histories. So this was a kind of move for autobiography and oral history. So this was about kind of partnerships between ordinary people and historians. So where people were learning skills so that they could do history for themselves. A similar project in London, the Centerprise Bookshop in Dalston, which was a kind of real sort of centre for the development of both black politics and black community history, as well as a wider history of the East End. And although that enterprise came to an end in 2012, I was very delighted to see that actually a new autobiography project, oral history autobiographical project, has been sponsored out of Heritage Lottery money. So this was a really vibrant moment in the development of historiography and social history in Britain, which sort of, I think, sort of starts kind of coming to an end with the defeat of Labour, with the Thatcher government in 1979, and with intellectuals like Stedman Jones thinking, you know, in that moment of defeat, turning to a kind of intellectual project to understand what went wrong with the left. And many of you will know it's the particularly groundbreaking essay that he wrote in that collection on the languages of Chartism. And this was a sort of Gareth Stedman Jones and many historians who I think kind of like followed him were particularly concerned to think about the role of language and discourse in constructing identities. And so this is very much the kind of beginnings of the linguistic turn, or the cultural turn, as it's sometimes been known within history. And this really kind of created some really important work. So, you know, one of the really important things that developed out of this moment was the kind of a reconsideration of the significance and meanings of class alongside other forms of identity like race and gender and sexuality, what we might now talk about in terms of intersectionality. And yet, I think, although this was very important work, something happened where people seemed to slip from view. And what historians were kind of interested in were texts. You know, everything was a text, and we have to read the text. But in practice, what this meant, I think, and it's also to do with a Foucauldian turn and everything, is that we looked at discourse and power. So we looked at institutions, the kind of records produced by institutions, and we looked at opinion makers, and we looked at how they construct the poor and the other, but we stopped looking at how those others define themselves. However, I think, and this is also, it has to be said, this is probably grossly misrepresenting a lot of work, and there was sort of important work which was still looking at agency in politics, but a lot of work, particularly on political history, I think became very dry and really only kind of accessible to the most intellectually ambitious students. However, I think that we can begin to see a kind of the beginnings of a return to narrative, a return to sort of people being at the centre of social histories, and an emphasis on agency. And one of the places we can see this was in Malcolm Chase's book on Chartism, which begins each chapter with a life, a Chartist life, including the life of Anne Dawson, who I think is 8 years old and who created this wonderful sampler about, you know, how she imagined the land plan would change her world. We can see, I think, that sort of shift in 3 books which have come out very quickly in succession on working class autobiography. But also, I think one of the interesting things is that the kind of works, that these works are also being addressed to a more kind of popular readership. So we've had Common People by Alison Light, Seth Coven's A Match Girl and the Heiress, and out of our period, but I think a really, you know, significant book, Selina Todd's The People. So part of this, I think, is actually to do with changes in both what's expected of academics in terms of who they're communicating to, and changes in publishing. But actually, I think that another kind of area of influence, of course, is the digital humanities. These projects in particular, the Old Bailey Online and a number of other projects which it has kind of spun, Connected Histories. It's now linked up to Founders and Survivors, which is digitising the convict records in Tasmania, and a new very, very big project on the digital panopticon. So this has been, it's about making those archives open to everybody, and there have been some really interesting creative uses of the Old Bailey Online. I'm not sure whether Jimmy McGovern consulted them when he was working on Banished. I suspect not. And maybe he should have gone and read some of all of this. So there's really kind of creative, interesting kind of projects coming out. It's used by lots of family historians and so on. And it's generating some absolutely terrific research, such as this related project, which is looking at the lives of 400 boys who were sent to reformatories at the end of the 19th century, and looking at what happened to them in their subsequent lives, tracing those boys. Did they get married? What did they work as? Did they reoffend? And so on. And this important research, which lo and behold, is suggesting that actually apprenticeships seem to have stopped these kids from reoffending, it is being disseminated in the media. So there we can see an article which came out in the Telegraph of all newspapers on this research. But I think there's still here that idea that the academics do their work and then we disseminate it. So what I want to sort of think about are some other kind of ways, forms, mediums for doing public history which are more interactive. So I think it's really one of the kind of spheres which I think is really important for this is blogging. And I'm just going to just quickly point out 4 blogs which have been run by postgraduate students who are kind of entering the kind of early career phase. So Leslie Hullance looks at workhouses in Swansea, but is interested in the social and interpersonal dynamics both within the house and with the rest of the community. And this is a way of sort of thinking about agency as well as simply the kind of power of the institutions. And that there were kind of acts and experiences of kindness as well as discipline and severity in those institutions. Similarly, Laura Mayer, who's at the moment is exploring Victorian ragged schools. And again, what she's aiming to do is to kind of recover the voices and the lives of boys from those institutions. Vicky Holmes, whose first blog was on Victorian domestic dangers. And I think one of the things about blogging is that it actually enables us to visualise things so that we can better think about their significance, their emotional significance, their importance in everyday life, and so on. And then Guy Walnuth's blog on Victorian policing, you can see he talks about it as bottom-up history, and he's using his own research there to engage both with current policy debates and popular representations of crime and policing. So one of the things that that I'm interested in is how does this kind of work, this form of communication, which is much more interactive, how might that actually change the ways in which we research, the ways in which we write and communicate? So this is, I think one of the important things about social media is that those of us who are part of these networks are actually kind of quite open to work which is going on in other disciplines, in different fields and in different periods. So one of my favourite blogs is The Many-Headed Monster, which is actually an early modern blog. I'd never have the time to read stuff on early modern history, but I do have time to read their blogs. And last year, they ran over the summer an online series on the history from below. And this summer, they're going to be running another series on voices of the poor. So I think this, again, sort of suggests the ways in which, you know, there's a kind of sort of movement, there's a groundswell going on. However, it's not just within the academy. And actually, I think that some of the most interesting, most creative researchers, as well as bloggers, are from outside the academy. This is one of them. Have a look at this. It's an absolutely extraordinary blog by Municipal Dreams, which looks at the kind of aspirations for social housing, better housing in the Victorian period and what happens to those aspirations over the 20th century and up until now. It's an absolutely stunningly visually beautiful blog, which is appropriate to its content. And this is by somebody who is an activist in kind of issues around social housing, but is not an academic. Another, I think, a really kind of interesting blogger, many of you will come across The Gentle Author, and his blog on Spitalfield's life, which, again, I think, you know, is an incredibly rich blog, a blog a day, ranging over Spitalfield's life, you know, up until now, since way back when, and sort of blending together contemporary voices with voices, photographs, and so on of people from the past and their stories. And you can see how he also, this is interesting, he's, in terms of telling the stories of the people of Spitalfields, he's also drawing on oral histories which are going on, such as by this organisation, Everyday Muslims. And the museums and archives and art galleries have also obviously been throwing their doors open, but they too, I think, are very active on sort of social media, and that, I think, has really helped to encourage us to talk not just to people like us, but to people who are working with the past in related ways and spheres. And of course, you know, the kind of interest in family history is something that is both, you know, is one of the most popular activities at the moment, and as we know, is a really kind of important sort of marker of identity, of our sense of who we are. this is a website which was related to, I think it was an AHRC sponsored project on mixed heritage families. But also you can sort of see here, this is the images from the Black Chronicles exhibition which took place earlier this year and was also produced in collaboration with Autograph ABB, who again are doing making very kind of creative uses of past and present kind of culture and politics. So how is kind of all of this mix? It's creating a very kind of exciting, diverse audience. But how is it also affecting the ways in which we write? Because that, I think, kind of affects the kinds of conversations that and interactions that we can have. So Alison Twells, in her blog, which is also a kind of working out of a book that she's working on, Socks for the Boys, is based on a pocket diary that her great aunt kept from when she received her first diary at the age of 14 until the night of her death, when she was way into her 70s. And so Alison has been working with this material and doing a kind of mixture of family history, social history, and also kind of reflecting on what it means to kind of work with this kind of material, what it means to be a historian, and so on. And she sort of she talks about how this kind of material, we can't just kind of present it and then let it speak for itself, that we kind of need to story it. And I think that that those of us who are kind of blogging are, I think that we're beginning to sort of find out that actually you can tell quite complex stories. You can raise kind of, you know, subtle interpretations through telling stories. You don't have to use a kind of heavily academic discourse. So storytelling, I think, as a mode of analysis and interpretation, it's also a kind of mode which John Herson is using in his book and the blog, which is now accompanying it. But that kind of storytelling sort of mode is accompanied by really rich and wide-ranging quantitative analysis and tracking of 200 families, the people who came from Ireland and settled in Stafford in the mid-19th century, and what happened to those families. And I think that sort of shows the ways in which we kind of move, that there's been a kind of moving away from that focus simply on the text, on, you know, on to looking at how we can find out about lives, about behaviour, about values even, by looking at a kind of patterns that are left in the record, traces that are left in the record, which can be suggestive of people's sensibilities, and so on. And this is something that I'm trying to track in my blog, Conviction Stories from a 19th Century Prison, where I'm also trying to kind of experiment with different ways of writing history in a way which is appropriate to the people that I am researching, and that I hope will be of interest to people outside the kind of cloistered world of academia. So I'm looking at material where I get brief fragments of people's voices and some surprising forms of self-articulation in, for instance, the tattoos that convicts wore on their bodies. But those kind of elusive kind of fragments can, I think, begin to assemble a kind of meaning if we look at that alongside the kind of patterns of their lives, their social networks, their friendships, their marriages, and so on. So that I think that we can find out about lives not simply through texts, or at least we need to actively reassemble texts. I'm just going to kind of finish off by just talking about two projects which suggest the ways in which researchers can work alongside people from the community, so that it's not just about us disseminating our work, but rather involving people in creating research together. I'm involved in an AHRC-funded scheme run at Manchester Metropolitan University called Creating Our Future Histories, and this has been set up for its training for postgraduates, students, and early career people to work alongside community activists and sometimes community historians in 7 different projects in the Manchester area. And I've been working with 3 researchers who actually they've been doing the work with the Anne Coates Dispensary Trust, which have been trying to preserve the hospital in Manchester, which was originally set up by the likes of James K. Shuttleworth and makes an appearance in Mary Barton. And they had to raise, over 3 months, they had to raise over £300,000 in order to release Heritage Lottery funding for this project, which is to turn the dispensary into a creative and community hub. And if they didn't succeed, what was left of the building was going to be knocked down. So there wasn't going to be a future history unless they saved this building. And so they set up a history of Anne Coates Dispensary in 100 objects, a blog a day that was going alongside this fundraising campaign. And by sort of like focusing short little blogs, this one is on the 1895 Anne Coates Brotherhood leaflet that was produced by Walter Crane. The Anne Coates Brotherhood were also running classes, ambulance classes for the ladies of Manchester to go and sort of help out at the dispensary and everything. So they're using this sort of blog to explore all different aspects of this hospital's past and its future, ranging from medical history to social history to literary fiction and so on. So that's kind of one example, I think, of how we can work with researchers in the community. Final sort of example is, as I said at the beginning, the history workshop movement really sort of was generated out of student activism in Ruskin. And I think that all the debates about public engagement have failed to acknowledge that students are part of the public, and our job is to train them to be able to become active citizens. And so I've been working with students in a 3rd year module called Writing Lives, where they are working with me to lay the kind of groundwork for what we hope will be a much bigger collaborative project. So my students each choose a memoir by an author from the Burnett collection of working class autobiography, and over the term they researched about 10 blogs about their authors' lives. They use online resources to research their blog, and they use social media to disseminate their research. And so we've got an example of one here. This is Billie Gina Thompson, who researched a wonderful mini frisbee born 1877. So this is part of a wider project that I'm working on, collaborating with the archive of the collection of working class autobiography at Brunel and the Working Class Movements Library to create an online archive and searchable database of working class autobiography. But built into that will be crowdsourcing, so that people can both submit their own life writing, they can work on transcribing memoirs, they can enter data to the database themselves. And there'll also be a community blog with links and resources, so that this, we hope, will be a collaboration between researchers, students, and public and the community. And I just wanted to show you a photograph of 3 of my students who presented about writing lives and students and public history at the 2014 conference on unofficial histories that was held at Huddersfield University last summer. But unfortunately, I haven't, I've not been able to get onto the web, so I haven't been able to find that photograph for you. But Unofficial Histories is part of a new network of, an international network of history from below. So I'm really kind of proud of the fact that my students are, I think, contributing to that movement. And I hope showing kind of one way in which we can all work together collaboratively. And that's me done.